Welcome to today's deep dive. I am your host, and as always, I'm joined by our resident expert to help break down some really fascinating research.
Glad to be here. I'm really looking forward to this one.
Yeah, so today we are unpacking a topic that honestly brings up a lot of baggage for people. We're looking at a body of source material titled A Rediscovered Identity, Not a New Assignment.
Right.
And the mission of our deep dive today is to figure out why the concept of the Great Commission, evangelism, sharing your faith, why it feels so incredibly overwhelming to the average person, and how this source proposes a total paradigm shift.
It is a massive shift.
Yeah.
I mean, the sources we're looking at argue that the obstacle to mission isn't a lack of strategy. It's actually a case of mistaken identity.
Which is such a relief to hear, because I want you, and I mean you listening right now, to picture a scenario.
Okay.
It's Sunday morning, or maybe you're in a Tuesday night small group. You're sitting in one of those cold metal folding chairs, drinking lukewarm coffee.
Oh, I know those chairs.
Right. And the topic inevitably shifts. The leader brings up the Great Commission. Go into all the world, make disciples.
And you can just feel the oxygen leave the room.
Exactly. The immediate reaction for most honest, well-meaning folks isn't excitement, it's dread.
It's evangelism guilt. It is a heavy, heavy feeling.
It's visceral. It feels like this weight dropping on your chest. You're sitting there thinking, I am barely keeping my head above water, paying my mortgage, doing my job, getting the kids to practice.
Yeah.
And now I need to go convert a nation.
It feels like a second full-time job. One
Yeah.
that you didn't apply for and you definitely don't feel qualified for.
Or it feels like a job for the professionals,
Right.
the people with the theology degrees and the microphones.
Right.
But the research we're diving into today argues that this overwhelm isn't because you're lazy. It suggests that we've totally misdiagnosed the problem.
We really have. The core premise of a rediscovered identity, not a new assignment, is that the church doesn't need a new program. It just needs to remember who it already is.
And reading through this material, I just felt this massive sense of relief. Because normally when we tackle this subject, I expect a to-do list.
5 ways to be a better evangelist this week.
Exactly. But this material is explicitly designed to take the pressure off, not to pile it on.
And to really set the stage for this, we have to look at a specific moment the text highlights. It's the locked room moment from the Gospel of John, chapter 20.
Oh, yeah. Set the scene for us there.
So post-crucifixion, the disciples are hiding out. They are absolutely terrified.
Because the authorities just executed their leader.
Right, and they are pretty sure they are next on the list. They aren't planning some massive world takeover. They are literally just trying to survive. The door is locked.
And then Jesus just appears.
He appears right in the middle of all that fear. And the source makes a great point about what he does not do. He doesn't hand them a strategic plan.
He doesn't roll out a whiteboard.
No.
No.
He doesn't give them a marketing deck or a quota of souls to save by the end of the quarter.
He doesn't say, all right, guys, here's the new 12-step program.
He says, peace be with you. And then he says, as the Father has sent me, I also send you. The author emphasizes that this was not a program launch.
It was an identity reveal.
Exactly. He was defining who they were by connecting them to who he is.
So let's dig into this idea of an identity crisis, because the source argues that modern churches are obsessed with what it calls the strategic crisis.
Yeah, we look at empty seats, or we look at a lack of community engagement, and the leadership immediately asks what strategy will fix this.
What's the silver bullet program?
Right, because the problem is super visible. Participation is low. We've all heard of the 80-20 rule.
Where 20% of the people do 80% of the work.
Right. But the text argues that in many church contexts, it's actually more like the 90-10 rule. A tiny percentage of people are doing the vast majority of the quote-unquote mission work.
So the natural knee-jerk reaction is to try and mobilize the other 90% with a new program.
But the diagnosis in our source material is that we've forgotten our identity. And this leads to a concept that text refers to as the false divide.
That part really struck me, the professionalization of ministry.
It's a huge historical shift. The text traces this back to the rise of Christendom, where we slowly shifted the idea of mission from being the responsibility of every believer to the exclusive domain of the clergy, the specialists.
So you get this mindset of, well, mission belongs to the paid staff. I'm just a spectator.
Or I'm just a donor. I pay the professionals to do the mission on my behalf.
It turns into a spectator sport, like a football game. You have 22 people on the field desperately in need of rest, being watched by 50,000 people desperately in need of exercise.
That is the perfect analogy. But the source provides this brilliant biblical rebuttal to that whole spectator mindset, specifically looking at the book of Acts, chapter 8.
And honestly, if you read the text too fast, you completely miss the irony of what happens there.
It's such a great detail. Persecution hits the early church in Jerusalem. Stephen has just been stoned. Believers are fleeing for their lives.
It's a total crisis.
A massive crisis. The text says they were scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria. But here's the kicker. The apostles, the professionals, the guys with the official job titles, they stayed in Jerusalem.
Wait, so the leaders stayed put and the regular folks were the ones who scattered?
Yes. The text is totally explicit about it. It says those who were scattered, the ordinary believers, the refugees running for safety, they went everywhere preaching the word.
That completely flips our modern model upside down.
Totally.
Because we usually think, send the pastor and the people will watch and support them. Acts is saying, no, the leaders held down the fort and the ordinary people went out and changed the world.
The expansion of the early church wasn't driven by some missionary journey meticulously planned by the apostles. It was driven by anonymous, everyday people moving through their natural networks.
Which connects back to a key term. The source unpacks the priesthood of all believers.
From 1 Peter chapter 2. It's a phrase that gets tossed around in theological circles, but the implication is actually radical. The argument here is that mission isn't just a department of the church. It is the very essence of the church.
You don't have a mission. You are the mission.
Exactly. You represent it simply by existing.
So if we buy into this, that we've had this deep identity crisis, how do we actually fix it? Because I can look in the mirror every morning and tell myself I'm a missionary, but that doesn't really change my Tuesday morning commute.
Right.
The text introduces this phrase, identity precedes mission.
This is the critical theological order of operations. You have to get the sequence right. If you put the mission before the identity, you get burnout.
You get guilt.
Heavy guilt.
Yeah.
You get people constantly trying to perform their Christianity.
Is there a biblical pattern for this order? Or is it just clever modern psychology?
Oh, it's deeply biblical.
Yeah.
Look at Abraham in Genesis 12. God says, I will bless you. That is identity, that's relationship. And then he says, and you will be a blessing. That's the function.
So identity comes first, then the function.
Always. Or look at the disciples in Mark chapter 3. It explicitly says, Jesus appointed the 12 that they might be with him identity and that he might send them out to preach, which is the mission.
You can't be sent out effectively if you haven't first been with him.
Being always comes before doing.
The source uses two analogies here that I think are super helpful for visualizing this. Salt and light.
Right, from the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5.
Think about salt for a second. Salt doesn't wake up in the morning, drink a cup of coffee, and stress out about trying to be salty today.
It doesn't schedule a strategy meeting with the pepper.
No, it doesn't read self-help books on how to be the saltiest salt in the shaker.
It just is salt. If it is salt, the saltiness is just an overflow of its basic nature. It literally cannot help but be salty.
Or take the branch and the vine analogy from John 15. A branch doesn't strain and grunt and turn purple trying to squeeze out a single grape.
Right, come on, just one grape.
It would look ridiculous. The branch just abides in the vine. It stays connected. And the fruit is the natural, inevitable byproduct of that connection.
This is what the text calls the aha moment. When mission flows from identity, it shifts from performance, which is anxious and exhausting, to overflow.
And that overflow is natural. It's relational. It's not about hitting some arbitrary quota. But there's a bigger theological concept here that anchors all of this, right? The source connects this to the nature of God himself using the term missio Dei.
Missio Dei, yeah, it sounds very academic.
Break that down for us non-Latin speakers.
It just translates to the mission of God. But the concept behind it is profound. It means that God is, by his very nature, a sending God. The Father sends the Son. The Father and Son send the Spirit. And the triune God sends the church.
So the church isn't the one coming up with the master plan.
Not at all. The church doesn't have a mission, as if it's a program we invented to help God out. The church is the mission. We are just getting caught up in this current of sending that started within God himself long before we ever arrived on the scene.
That really changes the perspective. It's not, God gave me a job to do and left the room and now I've proved myself.
No.
It's more like God is already moving, he's already going somewhere, and he just invited me to tag along.
Precisely.
Yeah.
We're sent before we ever go. Our going is just an outward expression of our inner sentness.
Okay, I want to pivot here. Because the theology is beautiful. Identity first, overflow, missio Dei, I absolutely love it. But the highly practical side of me is asking, what does that actually look like in real life?
Right, we can't just sit around cross-legged meditating on our identity all day.
Exactly. And the source argues we need what it calls movement infrastructure.
Right, because if identity is the engine, infrastructure is the scaffolding that supports it. You can't just yell at people to be missional without giving them a real framework to live it out. The text outlines 5 specific pillars for activating the church.
Let's run through these. Pillar 1 is identity formation, which is basically what we've been talking about. Knowing that you are an ambassador, a temple of the Spirit.
Correct. Because if you don't actually believe you're an ambassador, you won't speak up. You'll just think your perspective is merely your own private opinion.
Then Pillar 2 is confidence and clarity.
Yeah,
This is about removing role ambiguity.
this directly addresses that I'm not qualified feeling we talked about earlier. A lot of people don't share their faith simply because they don't think they're allowed to.
Or they think they're going to mess it up.
Exactly. They think, I'm going to get asked a really hard question about ancient history or quantum physics, and I'm going to look stupid. This pillar is about knowing you are, in fact, equipped.
Then Pillar 3, and I think this one is incredibly crucial, is sustaining spiritual depth.
This is vital. The text is very clear that depth precedes impact. In our modern culture, we constantly want the impact without the depths.
We want the miracles without the prayer.
We want the highlight reel. But look at Jesus. The text points out how he constantly withdrew to desolate places to pray before he ministered to the crowds.
So if you have high activity without that spiritual depth,
You are on a fast track to severe burnout. It creates what the author calls the hollowed-out believer. You're busy, you're doing all the right church things, but you are totally empty inside. And eventually you just collapse.
wow. Pillar 4 is real-world practice, moving from the theoretical to actual action. But not, weird action.
Right, not the guy with the bullhorn on the street corner action.
Yeah.
The source emphasizes that evangelism naturally travels along existing relational lines. Your neighbors, your coworkers, your family. It uses this great phrase, presence before proclamation.
Presence before proclamation. I love that so much. Just be a human being first. Be a good neighbor before you try to be a preacher.
You have to build the bridge before you try to drive a heavy truck across it. If people don't trust you as a person, they are never going to trust your message.
That makes perfect sense.
Huh.
And then the 5th pillar is multiplying unity, which honestly is a huge topic all on its own.
It really is.
Let's go deep on this one. Because normally when we hear the word unity in a church context, we think of an ecumenical potluck. Everyone just sort of smiling, getting along, and ignoring all their deep theological differences.
Hooping it under the rug.
Right. But the source makes a really strong claim that unity is actually a deliberate strategy.
It is. The author argues that unity isn't just a nice, warm sentiment. It is God's primary strategy for mission credibility. In the West, we tend to think of unity as just the absence of conflict, just not fighting. But the source points directly to John chapter 17, Jesus' high priestly prayer.
What does he pray for there specifically?
He prays that they may be one, so that the world may believe.
Oh, so that is a direct cause and effect.
It is entirely conditional. The credibility of the message is intrinsically tied to the unity of the messengers. That's the underlying logic. Division fragments the witness. Unity amplifies it.
Because when the world sees wildly diverse people, different races, different tax brackets, different backgrounds, different political leanings, genuinely loving one another and working together, it demands an explanation.
Because that kind of community does not happen naturally in the real world.
It really doesn't.
It's supernatural. And the source actually gives some incredible historical receipts to back this up. It points to the Moravians in the 18th century.
I have heard of the Moravians, but give us a rundown.
So they were a small community of religious refugees, essentially, living on this estate in Germany. They had a lot of doctrinal differences initially, but they committed to this deep shared sacrificial life together. And they started a prayer meeting that lasted, get this, 100 years.
Wait, a 100-year prayer meeting? Like 24/7?
Nonstop. Round the clock. One person would finish their 1-hour shift, and another person would step in. For a full century.
That is insane.
And from that incredibly intense hotbed of unity and prayer, that tiny community sent out more missionaries in 2 decades than all other Protestant groups combined had sent out in 2 entire centuries.
That is wild. A tiny group having a massive global impact simply because of their depth and their unity.
Exactly. Or look at the Wesleyan revival. They had these highly interconnected societies and bands. It created this deep accountability and momentum. You weren't just trying to be a solo Christian out in the wild. The source argues that we desperately need that kind of connective tissue today.
And again, the expert in the text connects this unity back to the nature of God, right?
It does. It goes right back to the Trinity. God is three in one, diversity in perfect harmony. When the church collaborates, when we partner across denominational lines, when we share our resources, when we stop competing with the church down the street, we're actually reflecting the very nature of God to a watching world. It's what gives the mission its credibility.
So bringing all of this high-level theology down to the pavement, what does this actually mean for you, the listener, right now? You might be thinking, look, I am not an 18th century Moravian missionary. I work in accounting. I drive a minivan. I'm exhausted. The
Mhm.
source introduces this really accessible concept of becoming a Great Commission ally.
This is the core call to action, and I really love the term ally here. It implies a partnership. It totally redefines your role. It's not about you having to do everything. You don't have to become the lead pastor. It's just about you doing your specific part exactly where you already are.
What are the practical steps the source lists for being an ally?
It starts with intentional prayer, but not just that generic Lord bless the whole world kind of prayer. It means interceding for very specific people, your actual neighbors, the guy sitting at the desk next to you, the barista you see every Tuesday morning.
Actually naming names.
Exactly. Then the next step is living visibly. And again, this isn't about standing on a street corner handing out tracts. It's about displaying real integrity in your workplace. It's about practicing hospitality in your neighborhood, being the one person who brings a sense of peace into a chaotic Zoom meeting.
We're back to presence before proclamation.
Then the third step is sharing your story. And this heavily emphasizes humility here. It's not about having a flawless, bulletproof theological argument to win a debate and shut someone down. It's simply about saying, hey, this is what Jesus has done for me.
Because people can argue with your logic all day long, but they really can't argue with your personal story.
Exactly. And finally, the fourth step, trusting God with results. This is huge for relieving that pressure we talked about. We are called to sow the seed. God is the one who gives the growth. We're responsible for our obedience, not for the final outcome.
I think we really have to address the elephant in the room, though. Fear. We touched on it a bit earlier, but the source explicitly talks about the fear of not knowing enough. That absolute paralysis of, who am I to say anything to anyone?
That is a very real, very common fear. But the source reminds us where our authority actually comes from. If you look at the text of the Great Commission, Jesus starts the whole thing by saying, all authority in heaven on earth has been given to me.
To him, not to us.
Right. And therefore go. We go in her, his authority, not relying on our own competence. Think of a political ambassador. An ambassador doesn't speak on their own personal authority. They don't invent the country's foreign policy on the fly. They just faithfully represent the king.
That really takes a massive weight off your shoulders. You don't have to be the genius expert. You just have to be a faithful messenger.
Exactly. If you get stumped by a question, you get stumped. It's fine to say, I don't know. Your value isn't in knowing everything. Your value is in pointing to the one who does know everything.
Which brings us right back to that feeling of deep relief we started the show with. We aren't being handed a new, impossible, exhausting assignment.
No. We're simply rediscovering an identity that was already given to us the very moment we started following Jesus.
So let's recap this whole journey. We started with the tension, that heavy, sinking feeling that mission is just another massive burden added to an already overloaded life. But we've seen today that the problem isn't a lack of a good strategy, it's a forgotten identity.
We have forgotten that we are fundamentally a sense people, not because we eagerly signed up for a volunteer program, but because we belong to a sending God.
And we talked about the real danger of the professionalization of ministry, falling into the trap of thinking it's just the pastor's job. But Acts chapter 8 shows us that the explosive power of the gospel is unleashed when ordinary believers like you and me realize that we are the primary plan.
And we explored the movement infrastructure needed to actually support that reality. Identity, depth, and unity. Understanding unity not just as a nice, polite idea, but as a strategic multiplier that actively proves to the world that the message is true.
The vision laid out here is just really compelling. The church doesn't need to be cleverly reinvented. We don't need a slick version 2.0 with better lasers and louder sound systems. We just need to be restored to what we always were in the New Testament.
Ascend people. Salt and light. It really is as simple as that.
There is a quote from the source material that I think sums this entire deep dive up perfectly. It's presented as a challenge, really. It says, the question is no longer whether the church has a mission. The question is whether we will live as if we are the mission.
That is the ultimate shift. It's subtle, but it changes absolutely everything. If we are the mission, then every single interaction, every quick email, every conversation over the fence with your neighbor is an opportunity. Not an opportunity to perform, but an opportunity to just overflow.
So, for you listening today, the takeaway isn't to go out and try to strive harder this week. It's not to frantically add 3 more church activities to your Google Calendar.
No. The takeaway is to stop striving and to start abiding. To let your deep identity in Christ become the natural source of your outward influence.
And before we wrap up, I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over. Something that builds on all of this, but really challenges how we practically operate. If the church doesn't have a mission, but rather the church is the mission, what does that mean for how we design our physical church buildings?
Oh, that's a great question.
Or how we set our church budgets? If Sunday morning isn't the main event, but just the locker room where we get equipped to go back out onto the field, maybe our entire calendar needs a redesign. Just something to chew on as you go about your week, rediscover who you are, and the rest will follow. Thanks for diving deep with us today.
Always a pleasure.